All you.
Hi, I'm Caroline Pelletier, Assistant Town Manager for the Town of Freeport. I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. It's not a lovely night to leave your house. We do have quite a few people on Zoom. So this is workshop number 3 in a series of 4 for the comprehensive plan. We started by talking about a survey and doing some survey work at the community center. We had a great forum on housing a couple weeks ago at Meeting House Arts. Tonight we're here to talk about the environment. That includes all aspects of the environment, from open space, natural resources, marine resources, trails, and of course climate change. And we will be talking a little bit about our new draft climate action plan tonight and some of the goals that were identified in there. Like I said, we're not done yet. This is 3 out of 4. We are going to have one more meeting after tonight, which is the future land use workshop. I think that's the one that's most exciting because it takes everything we've done so far in this process and at these 3 meetings to really get down and see what we said we want to preserve, what we want, and where we want it. So we hope that you'll save the date for Monday, November 18th, which will be our final of 4. And on that note, we have a lot planned for tonight, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. So I did want to give a little intro, kind of the background. Caroline mentioned this is the 3rd of 4 public workshops. Looking at this timeline here, we are in task 2 of the visions and values. What we did in task 1 is very important, and it informs kind of a lot of this public outreach work. That includes working with the planning board and writing inventory chapters. But this is all part of a larger effort to get the town a new updated comprehensive plan. And task 2, the visions and values, relies a lot on public input, whether it's reading the inventory chapters on the website, futurefreeport.com, or participating in these workshops. We had a really great turnout at the housing workshop a couple weeks ago, and tonight we're going to be focused on the environment. Some things I did want to highlight going into this. So the comprehensive plan covers all types of information. So that's housing data, economic data, population data. Some of the growth estimates we discussed with the planning board in the inventory chapters give Freeport 2.5% to 11% of increased population over the next 15 to 20 years. Thinking about where people are going to live, the downtown village plan that Freeport adopted a couple years ago talks about 1,200 residents in Freeport Village. So with a growing population, thinking about where growth is going to be in the town is an important part of this. Right alongside, we think about the economy, and that's the evolving landscape after COVID-19, the change in retail shopping, whether it's because of COVID-19 or even just the shift to online modes of economic purchasing. And then the last place, what brings us tonight, is that community and outdoor recreation. So when we talk about growth, we talk about housing, we're also considering open space, trails, natural resources, the coastline. And Freeport has all of this. So one of the important things we're trying to find out from the Freeport residents is, how do we balance growth, the need for housing, economic investments, economic development, with open space, climate action planning, climate change? How do we build resiliency in the town? Tonight, we're going to be utilizing Menti. It's an online platform. You have some forms on your table, and for those joining us remote, please join as well. You can use your phone to access this QR code, or go to menti.com and enter in the code 3332-7641. So I'll give everyone a couple minutes or a couple seconds to log in. This is a very participatory tool for us to give a real-time reaction and audience ask questions. And it's very straightforward. So I'll step away, so I'm not in the picture. So you just log on. We're going to prompt you with some questions, and we'll get some real-time feedback, which will really help facilitate our conversation and get a little bit of insights from the community. So I'll give you guys just a couple seconds to log in. Great. And this link will also be open for the next 2 weeks. So once we get this presentation posted online, people will be able to watch it, go through it, and join in the fun as well. As we go through the presentation, the code will flash at every point, so don't feel like you missed out. But I'm going to keep on going. So the first question tonight is, what is your favorite outdoor space in Freeport? This is kind of a test question, kind of get where you're thinking about. So we have the options of parks and public areas, trails and natural areas, waterfront and swimming, and other. Don't worry if your answer in your head falls in between two categories, just choose one. It's not binding. Your name's not connected to it, so don't worry too much. If anyone's having any difficulty, you can raise your hand and someone from the team might be able to help you. Ben, can you come help here? Keep your hand raised if you would like some help. Instead of using code again, you can go to menti.com. There will be more questions, so don't feel if you missed it. We'll help you throughout the presentation, so just keep your hand up. Looking at the answers, we had the most is clearly trails and natural areas. This is an important question because we sent out a survey as part of our initial round of visioning for the comprehensive plan. Looking at the results of that, where we had over 500 participants from Freeport at our first workshop and through our survey online, most people put parks and public areas and then trails and natural areas, which isn't too far off from the room. We know that Freeport has a lot of really great parks and public areas, whether it's right on the coast or like scattered throughout town. Wolf's Neck, thinking about one of them. But what we're oh yes.
RSU5 guest network, and it's all lowercase RSU5 guest.
Yeah.
Or there's a QR code in the back corner that you can scan.
Yes. So again, the Wi-Fi password for those in the room, RSU guest, and then all lower.
RSU5.
RSU5 guest. And then the password for it is RSU5 guest, all lowercase. But I do want to keep moving on just in the interest of time. We're really looking for feedback on Freeport's environment. What we know is that public open space is critical. Winslow Memorial Park, Wolf's Neck Woods. People talked about trails tonight. That's what's on people's mind. We think about open space connectivity. Where do we conserve land? And our consultant from FB Environmental, Maggie, will be kind of giving an overview of that tonight. What we, oh, sorry. It should be up here to the fall. Cool.
Yeah, just up on this collar.
I'll do this. Second. Check, cool, great, sorry about that. We found out in our survey results and at the first workshop that open space and the environment is critical for children activities. A lot of families utilize these spaces for, family time, recreation activity. And generally across Freeport, we found that the open space is critical in supporting community gatherings, whether it's town-led events, friends hanging out, families gathering in the summer, and recreation is an important life in Freeport, whether in the summer, utilizing the water, or in the winter, being cold outside. It's always fun. What we're hoping to get tonight, this is not a total list, just a few of the elements we're considering when we talk about the tabling activities later tonight, is how can we balance growth and conservation in Freeport. So we know that there's a demand for housing, economic development, but we also know there's a huge desire to conserve more open space, get more trails, increase outside activity. In terms of the environment, what are the town's highest priorities? What do people think the town of Freeport should be doing to support trail growth, to support conservation efforts? The similar is a third, where can Freeport excel in this efforts, in these environmental climate change related activities? And then really a big piece of the climate action plan and the comprehensive plan is, what is the vision? What does Freeport want? What do the people who live here, whether it's been 20 years, 5 years, how do they feel that Freeport should utilize the resources, focus their efforts? And that's why we bring everyone here tonight. I know that there are people scattered throughout the room. As we move into the tabling activities, that we have planned for after our presentation. We hope that everyone can move to the tables with maps. We can pull more chairs. We can set up another table as well. But once we move to that, so feel free to stay where you are now. But we'll be facilitating some of this conversation. For those online, we have some questions that we'll pose, and we'll be putting a Google form, online survey for you to fill out today, because we do not have the chat enabled on Zoom. So with that being said, we're going to be moving into the presentation of what we learned from the natural resources inventory. FB Environmental, Maggie, will be joining us today and providing, they worked on our chapters, the maps you see on the table. And yeah, Maggie, take it away.
Great, thanks, Charles. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, all right. So my goal today, well, my name's Maggie. I work at FB Environmental in Portland. I guess you can really hear me now. I work at FB Environmental in Portland. I'm a water resource scientist and project manager there. But I also live in Freeport with my 2 kiddos. So this project is near and dear to my heart, and it's fun to be here tonight in this role. So the goal, as Charles said, of this presentation is to give us a high-level overview of natural resources in Freeport, kind of the existing conditions, to set us up for these conversations about our visions and values and how to plan for the future moving forward. So I'm gonna, in the next 30 minutes or so, go over a quick Freeport geography for everyone, a short overview on wildlife, who lives here and what habitats are they using, water resources in Freeport, conservation and public access. So are these resources protected? How are they protected? And does the public have access to these resources? And I will just touch at the end on pressures. Your sustainability committee has done a wonderful climate action plan related to climate change in Freeport. And so that's another resource that should be looked at by everyone in Freeport alongside this comprehensive planning effort. All right, so quickly here, we're going to be looking at a lot of maps today, and there's maps on your table. So I just wanted to orient everyone. So all the maps will look like this. You can see in the bottom right, the north arrow will always be up. The town boundary is shown in this reddish color. That's the Freeport town boundary. Streams are all in blue. You can see I-295 is the large road right down the center, and I have circled the 2 exit 20 and exit 22 on and off ramps from I-295. And then you could see arrows in the top left corner that point to Route 125 and Route 136 leading out of Freeport. Here is Hedgehog Mountain. So Hedgehog Mountain is our highest point in Freeport at about 308 feet in elevation. If you haven't been there, it's by the recycling center. It has about 5 miles of trails, and it is managed by the town and the Conservation Commission. It was about 100 acres that was purchased in 1989, and additional 96 acres that was purchased in or acquired in 2001. And so this is a really important kind of place in Freeport, both to the community for recreation, but also because it is our highest spot in town. All right, so we're gonna try one of these Menti questions. So how many miles of coastline, excluding the islands, do you think Freeport has? We'll give you a few minutes. Oh, all right. I wasn't sure how those were going to pop up, so cool. All right, ready? So we have about 35 mainland miles of coastline. So you can see kind of the coast pictured here. Those are centered around the 3 major peninsulas. So we have Flying Point, Wolf's Neck Road, and Staples Point, where Winslow Park is. But that's not to exclude the islands completely. Freeport has about 15 islands, and that brings our coastline up to about 41.9 miles. This includes, I've highlighted here in pink, Sister's Ledge, which is a state designated seabird nesting habitat. So I just thought that was a pretty unique feature that Freeport can call part of our community. Okay, so for the next few slides, I'm going to go over kind of who lives here. And before I get into this discussion for the slides is mostly about unique species that are in Freeport. But I just want to state before we get into that, that the common species in Freeport, so turkeys and the foxes and the deer, those are common, and we want to keep them common. So we're going to have a discussion kind of about some of the especially significant species that we have. But keep in mind that as we have this discussion, we want to also be keeping our common species common. All right, so we'll start out here this is the salt marsh sparrow. So it in 2023 was listed as a state endangered species, and Freeport is home to the salt marsh sparrow. So it has been observed in Freeport along the Cousins River. You can see I have an arrow to that section of the river where you can find the salt marsh sparrow. The salt marsh sparrow spends its entire life in the salt marsh, which is pretty interesting characteristic. And populations have been declining, partially because of human disturbance, encroachment on habitat, stormwater control, but also because the sparrow nests are really low to the ground. So they're just a few inches off the ground, and they're really vulnerable to storm surges and sea level rise. Doesn't like when I move that way. Another species that we have that's a species of special concern is the great blue heron. I identified out on French's Island, but I think we've probably all seen the great blue heron, so it feels a little more common, but it's listed as a species of special concern because there are declining populations in Maine. Aside from the state listed species, I thought it would be kind of fun to point out a really unique species that we have here in Freeport. So this is an eastern leatherwood shrub, which you can find in fairly dense populations on Hedgehog Mountain towards the summit. And it's a species that's present and indicates relatively healthy soils. So it's pretty neat that we have it here. It's called leatherwood because it's really hard to bend or break. In addition to these terrestrial species that are called Freeport home, we have a handful of marine species. So here you can see we have softshell clams, 2022 landings, which we have included in the Freeport Comp Plan for softshell clams, is about 304,000, followed by American oysters at about 204,000, lobster just behind it at 197, and Atlantic menhaden at about 150. And those are in pounds, landings are in pounds. But what you don't see here is that we've seen a dramatic decline in that softshell clam population and hardshell clam population, but the softshell clam population landings are greater in Freeport. And we've seen a concurrent increase in the landings of American oysters. All right, so for the next few slides, I'll just talk about what habitats these species use in Freeport. So first, we have the state designated inland waterfowl and wading bird habitat. So this is state designated. We have 2 locations in Freeport that are designated as significant habitat for inland waterfowl and wading bird. So those are, one is like the Florida Lake area, and one is on the Pownell Freeport town line near Chandler Brook. And so waterfowl, there's things like duck and geese, and wading birds are things like heron and egret. They use this habitat for their nesting, for their feeding. It's really important to the ecology of the town. And in addition to that state designated habitat, we also have about 1,300 acres of freshwater wetland in Freeport, and Freeport's home to 15 vernal pools. So if you're not familiar with vernal pools, they're basically a special group of wetlands that form in the springtime after snow melts in depressions in the landscape. So there are these temporary pools of water that form in the woods that are hugely significant for reptile and amphibian species. The spotted turtle, salamanders, and wood frogs all use those, and they use the pool, but they also use the adjacent upland area as part of their life cycle. So conserving that whole area around those vernal pools is super important. In addition to the inland habitat, we have tidal waterfowl and wading bird habitat. We have about 10,800 acres of this along the coast of Freeport. You can see in the map here, it's kind of that teal color, and it's most of our coastline. So it just shows that Freeport's coast is incredibly important for these waterfowl and wading birds in their migratory routes, in their nesting, in their foraging. Another important habitat we have here is our coastal bluffs. So Freeport has about 29 miles of bluff shoreline, and of that, about 7.5 miles of it are considered unstable. Those are mostly on the eastern and southern sections of the Wolf's Neck Peninsula and on the western and southern sections of Flying Point Neck Peninsula and Little Flying Point and the islands. Another really critical habitat that often gets overlooked that we have a little bit of in Freeport, 2.7 acres, unfortunately, as of 2022, are eelgrass beds. So eelgrass beds, you can find them, they're basically like meadows in the ocean and in the intertidal area. And they're home, they're nursery ground for many fish species, but they also are important in trapping sediments that come from the landscape and creating those beds for shellfish. So they play a lot of critical roles in that ecosystem, and they are intimately linked to our working waterfront and our landings for marine species in Freeport. Unfortunately, eelgrass beds have been seeing a significant decline. So I think we have another Menti question here. So how many acres of eelgrass beds were surveyed in Freeport in 2010, considering that there are 2.7 acres that were surveyed in 2022? All right, so you can see here that in 2010, there was almost 2,000 acres of eelgrass beds in Freeport. This has been happening all over Casco Bay. This is not just us. There's a lot of damage to eelgrass beds from the invasive green crab that actually, while they're feeding, they dig up the beds and the eelgrass can't survive it. Also, traditional moor and tackle can be really hard on these beds. So we're seeing a huge decline in this habitat in Freeport. To kind of broaden it out, I just wanted to point out that the entire Maquoit and Middle Bay area, all the way from the Royal River in Yarmouth up to Harpswell Neck, that's all, and that whole area is designated as statewide ecologically significant area. So basically what that's saying is that the state has identified this area as a priority to protect biodiversity moving forward. And I think it's a pretty critical point for us to consider that, you know, we have this huge coastal resource that we're managing and we're responsible for caring for. In addition to that, when we're looking at habitat, it's important to look at undeveloped or unfragmented habitat blocks. So you can see here on the right, this is a map of undeveloped blocks. It's obviously a coarse scale, but you can see in the yellow that those are blocks that are over 100 acres in size, and the arrows point to the blocks of over 100 acres in size. So you can see that arrows 1 and 2 point to 2 blocks on the east side of 295 that are greater than 100 acres. One's up by Kelsey Brook and one's down in South Freeport. And then numbers 3 through 8 on the west of 295, you can see. So there's 3 and 4 are just north and south of Webster Road. Let's see, and yeah, there's some areas around Hedgehog Mountain and a little bit north around Collins Brook. All right, so we'll just move quickly into water resources in Freeport so that we can touch on all of our resources before we move into our visioning exercise at the tables. So rivers and streams, you can see in this map that there are 5 major drainage divides in town. The two big ones are the Cousins River, which is in that light blue color, and the Harriseket River, which is in the orange color. And of course, the Harriseket drainage area takes up most of the town of Freeport. Other than that, most of the drainages are direct drainages to coastal waters. Freeport's home to all kinds of small streams, but two of them we want to talk about today are Frost Gully Brook and Concord Gully. So you can see here that the orange watershed drainage area, that goes to Frost Gully Brook, and then the drainage area on the bottom, that goes to Concord Gully. So these two streams are urban impaired streams. So that means the state of Maine, the Department of Environmental Protection, is responsible for regulating the water quality in all Maine waters. And they basically set these standards for waterways. Every water is assigned a class, so AA, A, B, C. And your water has to meet its designated class based on the water quality data and the uses that that water body is providing. And so what being impaired means is that that water is not meeting its use. So these two streams are currently not meeting state standards, but I think it's important to point out that there's been a lot of work in these streams, particularly Frost Gully Brook. There have recently been 3 dams that were removed from that brook to restore connectivity for aquatic species. So that's an incredible effort. And the Freeport Conservation Trust and Trout Unlimited worked for a long time to make that happen and to restore that connectivity. As far as groundwater goes, Freeport has 2 primary drinking water sources. So you can see here the general zones that are covered. We have the Freeport Water District in this light blue color, and then we have the South Freeport Water District in the orange. You can see that the Freeport Water District kind of covers downtown and then out on Desert Road a ways and then down Route 1 South. South Freeport Water District covers the South Freeport Village area and then South Freeport Road out to Route 1. What is evident here is that there's much of Freeport that's not on town water. And so those residents all have private wells. So there's about 1,400 private wells listed in the state database for Freeport. Stormwater management is a big consideration in town, particularly in the downtown where we have a lot of impervious cover. So the rainwater from storms can't infiltrate into the ground. Freeport is part of the municipal separate stormwater sewer system program. That's a federal program that helps communities regulate their stormwater runoff. It basically assigns what they call minimum control measures, ways of monitoring the stormwater coming off of your town, coming off of your impervious surfaces, going through your outfalls into your waterways. Freeport is part of a local stormwater group with other communities to try to work together to meet MS4 requirements. Stormwater pollution is huge, particularly in the face of climate change, where we have storm events that are coming in higher intensities, the water can't infiltrate into the ground quick enough. So it hits the pavement, it hits the sidewalks, it carries all the pollutants with it and runs off the landscape and into our local waterways. I'll quickly touch on, there's a handful of zoning measures in Freeport that are related to natural resources, just so you can have these on your mind as we think about protection and conservation of resources and balancing natural resource conservation with growth. So we have the shoreland zoning, which is basically in place to protect land area that's adjacent to rivers and freshwater and coastal wetlands and streams. We have the Coastal Waters Ordinance, which prohibits discharge and dumping of pollutants into tidal water. It also has some provisions around marine construction to protect marine waters. We also have a Shellfish Conservation Ordinance. So that is basically established to monitor shellfish harvesting. And it also establishes a surcharge for all the shellfish licenses to help pay for some of the water quality testing. We also have a municipal shellfish aquaculture ordinance, and that was created by the community to work with aquaculture leaseholders who are working through the state program to basically establish a mechanism for the town being part of the approval process for new licenses for aquaculture operations. All right, so what % of Freeport's land do you think is conserved? I'll give you a few minutes to answer that. That's funny. All right. So 14% is the answer. So about 3,300 acres of Freeport's land is conserved. That is primarily conserved through the Freeport Conservation Trust, but there are other outside groups that also hold easements or fee-owned properties in Freeport. You can see here in the map on the right, and this is the map that you have in front of you, that we've highlighted some of these, more popular or larger conservation properties for you. And so that conserved land is in the green dots with the green outline. We also put municipally owned land on there in the orange. I think, primarily what we wanted to show here is that if something is municipally owned, it doesn't necessarily mean it's conserved. And I think it can be easy for us to conflate those two. So be thinking about municipally owned spaces and spaces that you would want to see conserved moving forward. As far as public access goes to natural spaces in Freeport, on the water, we have about 350 moorings in the Harristicate River and a total of about 220 boat slips. So those are primarily at the Town Wharf, the Harristicate Lunch and Lobster, Brewers South Freeport Marine, Strouts Point Wharf, Harristicate Yacht Club, and Dunning Boatyard. And so I think what's pretty clear there is that they are all mostly concentrated in some key critical spaces. And all of our public launch locations our docks are influenced by the tide. And so we don't have any deep water access locations. And the town is working on that through a separate grant to consider deep water access for our working waterfront. In addition to these larger spaces, there's also hand carry access at 5 sites in Freeport. All right, so I'm just going to quickly touch on the pressures that we're seeing to natural resources in Freeport. Of course, there's a lot more on this in the Climate Action Plan, but hopefully this is enough to get us thinking about what we're going to see coming in Freeport that's going to impact our resources. As Charles said in the beginning, a lot of these things are outside of our control. So while we can and should all be thinking about our carbon emissions and how our individual footprints are contributing to the problem, as a community, we also have to put our heads together and understand that these impacts are coming for us, and we need to be working strategically to be more resilient and to prepare together as a community. So as Charles said in the beginning, we are seeing growth and development in Freeport. The population has increased by about 83% between 1970 and 2020. We looked at this map last week at the housing workshop, so you can see this is just building permit data from 2014 to 2023. And what I want to get at here is that you could see that building is occurring in a fairly scattered pattern across the town. So we're seeing development and building in most parts of Freeport. This is particularly thought-provoking when you compare it against this undeveloped land layer. So we can kind of go back and forth and think about how that development is breaking up key critical wildlife corridors and connected habitat in Freeport, and try to think strategically about where we conserve lands and open spaces, not only for public access and neighborhood access, but also to maintain these larger blocks of connectivity. Here are just some of the key topics that are covered in the Climate Action Plan. So the Climate Action Plan goes, that the Sustainability Committee put together, talks about impacts from heat, impacts from intense storms, impacts from sea level rise, and impacts from changing ocean conditions. We could talk about all of these in a lot more detail, but they're all coming for us. We're seeing changes. The Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans. As has been evident in the last week in our country, like this is here and we really need to be thinking about it. And the Climate Action Plan lays out some really fantastic strategies as a community for how we can be thinking about being more resilient and adapting to these changes at the local level. With changes in climate, of course, come with changes in invasive species. So I've put a few examples up here. Brown-tailed moth on the left, that's one that's particularly relevant in Freeport. There's been a lot of issues with brown-tailed moth. Japanese knotweed is a representation of one of the many common invasive species that I see all over town. Other species such as bittersweet are everywhere. As ranges shift for these invasive species and they move north into Freeport, we also see some of our native species that are getting pushed out of their ranges. So not only are they seeing pressure in habitat competition, but they're becoming less adaptable to the conditions themselves. On the right here, I have a green crab. We talked about how green crab is one of the major causes of eelgrass bed decline in Casco Bay. So this is a huge issue for us here in Freeport as well. So with that, we'll open it up to some questions and then we will move into our tabling exercise for the next half hour. So thank you.
Thanks, Maggie, so much for that. So we're going to be, before we jump into our tabling exercises, I did want to open up the floor to anyone in the audience who has any questions about the comprehensive planning process, anything in the presentation you just saw, just anything that will help frame the tabling work. After the tabling exercise, we're going to bring everyone back together and do another 30 minutes or so of community dialogue for people to ask questions and report back on the tabling. But for right now, if you have any questions on the presentation, please raise your hand and we'll get you a microphone.
Thank you, Brian. Hi, I'm Melanie. Question on the eelgrass slide. Is there supporting documentation around why it went from 1,500 to 11 to 700 and then now down to 22? Thank you.
That's a great point. And I do think ability in survey methods and ability to survey the eelgrass well. So I think that is an issue in the survey method and approach. But I would say, like on a larger scale in Casco Bay, we are seeing decreases in all the beds. So we know that even though there's some uncertainty in those individual numbers, we know that beds are declining.
Hi, I'm Jenny. Maggie, you mentioned these really large blocks of over 100 acres, which are of clear conservation importance. Have there been any studies that have looked at the connectivity around the homes that we have in our neighborhoods in this rural area which are actually still quite wooded and support a lot of the species that you were talking
about? I don't know if I'd say there's any studies specific to Freeport. I think that connectivity is important when we think about development patterns. So, a common thing that'll happen with development is like an open space set aside. And so development will be clustered so that you can leave larger unfragmented pieces. But, when we do have like a house on a 2-acre lot, even though there is forest around each of those houses and on each of those lots, when we have roads and driveways and fences intersecting habitat, it does play a negative role on the connectivity for the species using that. So there are ways to think about that with development moving forward and to try to prioritize connectivity. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, excuse me, Chalmers, two questions. First, I can't believe there are only 15 vernal pools in our entire area, and I've just wondered how you measured that. Second, following up on the point about connectivity, I wish we had on our maps here to look at how we can connect these 100-acre parcels so that there could be wildlife interchange among them.
The vernal pools, so those, all 15 vernal pools that have been identified are considered significant by the state. So it just means that those are the pools the state has been to and or a wetland scientist has been to during the critical season and has looked at egg masses and has looked at fairy shrimp and categorized it as a significant vernal pool. It certainly doesn't mean that there aren't other vernal pools in town. So thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate it. And then your second question, yeah, I mean, you can check out, the state has, have you been to the Beginning with Habitat portal? They have data on, they have maps that are interactive. It's Beginning with Habitat. You go on there, they have interactive maps where you can look at unfragmented habitat and then you can overlay all of these state listed species on top of that. So you can kind of think about connection that way. But that's probably the best I have for that question.
This is kind of a foundational question. Are you able to clarify what the distinction is in the roles between the Conservation Commission and a conservation trust? I know one is a town committee and the other is a nonprofit, but what roles do they play and how do they interface with work happening in the town?
That's a good question. Maybe someone from the town could speak about that better than I could, but I would say like on a broad, kind of a big picture answer, your conservation trust, you know, it's a land trust, so it actually owns land, fee-owned parcels, or it holds easements, and it has a staff and a stewardship group that can go out and monitor those lands. It has a donation base to put the money into the conservation of those properties. The Conservation Commission in the town is kind of thinking about conservation from the lens of the town. So they're trying to think about this big picture, but also connect it to all of the other priorities and working groups that are going on in the community. There are some properties like Hedgehog Mountain that the Conservation Commission does directly manage and steward, but I think that the town is limited in how much of that they can do based on just the number of staff that the town has to carry out that kind of work. I don't know if anyone from the town wants to give a more specific answer than that.
Anyone from the Conservation Commission? I think that's a pretty good, high level, accurate summary. The town of Freeport does have a couple municipal properties, or a handful, that the Conservation Trust manages for us and oversees the management plan, but we haven't really been adding land to those in recent time. I think the Conservation Trust has been acquiring more land than the town of Freeport. And we have another hand up back here if we're ready for the next question.
Actually, sorry, I don't have a question. I just want to let you guys know there is really good connectivity data. I'm happy to share it with you, and we could definitely look at the town and figure out where those places are. The Nature Conservancy's mapping is pretty good. It's, you know, again, it needs to be ground truth, but it is available, since that seems to be something people are bringing up.
Thanks.
I think you were cutting out just a bit, but you said you're at the Nature Conservancy. No, or just using the Nature Conservancy resources. Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
We have another hand up over here, Chalmers.
In my view, that statement about what the Conservation Commission does is not right. They spend an enormous amount of volunteer time handling these 6 parcels that the town owns, like Hedgehog and Florida Lake. And they really put an enormous amount of time into that. The town does a little bit of that for them, but they're basically a volunteer conservation core, but that's all they do. They're not looking at the entire conservation question for the town.
Thanks, Chalmers, for that. We'll do these two. We have 3 hands up. We'll do 3 more questions, and then we'll move into our tabling activities. So one back there with the microphone, and one here, and one there.
My name is Bob. You indicate there are 35 miles of coastline, and 29 of those are bluffs. So we've got 6 miles then, which may be all or in large part a marshland, which as the seas rise, they will be inundated. And if we want to protect what is protected by those marshlands, there will need to be room adjacent to it, into which the marshlands can in fact retreat and be protected. Is there any information? And so if it's developed land, it's dead, it's not available. Is there any information on what of those adjacent lands, what size, how close they are, that could be looked at as possibly extending shoreland zoning to provide that room for marshlands to continue to exist?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So just because I think the mic's breaking up a little, the question was about marsh migration and how we can look at adjacent lands to marshes. And I know the climate action plan specifically does look at that adjacent land. I was looking at that earlier. And actually, most of the adjacent land, or a lot of it, is in conservation. But it's a good point. I mean, we can think about conserving lands where we should expect to see marsh migration occur. But we could also think about regulatory measures for protecting that, or expanding buffers around marshes for, where we think that they could migrate into.
That might be addressed comprehensive plan. Will it be a possibility?
Well, maybe you can speak to the level of detail in the comp plan, actually. That would be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. With the comprehensive plan, because there's so many topics I covered, one of the big ones is existing land use. Maggie covered some of the town zoning. So we have the shellfish ordinance, you have the shoreline zone. The shoreline zone is mandated at the state level. So coming from DEP reviews that, it's a process. The towns can, extend that, look at it in different ways. Really, it's more of the comprehensive plan doesn't necessarily say we're going to do X, Y, and Z. But one of the important things that we can do, and things like tonight is important, is to identify those priorities so that we can include it in a vision or mention it as part of a larger policy initiative. So things about identifying areas of conservation. So it's a good point.
But I do think like a specific recommendation like that is a good thing to discuss with the sustainability committee, because something that specific will probably be something that's moved through like that committee or maybe you're on that committee. Yeah, one more over here.
You had, on the map that we have in front of us, you've identified some very clear definitions of what conserved lands are, but we seem to be using different definitions in different places. So based on these definitions, you mentioned it's 14% of land in Freeport is conserved. By the climate action plan's definitions, it's 16. With Freeport Conservation Trust estimates, it's 18. So I think especially since we're setting a goal in the climate action plan to get to 30%, I think we need to be using very clearly defined areas of conservation and maybe grades of conservation, depending on whether they're in conservation easements or held in some other way. But across all of the town documents, I think we ought to be using the same number and the same definitions.
Yes, that's a really good point. As part of our conversation, that came up at the planning board when we brought our initial draft over. So we're, as part of our stakeholder outreach and public participation, we're working with different groups throughout the town to get their feedback. So we had 14%. A lot of our information comes from the state. So obviously the state can only know so much. And a lot of the better information, the more accurate information we get from volunteers in the town, Freeport Conservation Trust. So getting to that point is like an important factor for us to make sure that the data is consistent across these different guiding documents, and we're using correct terminology because there's different levels of conservation. So as we're working through our final draft of the comprehensive plan, we're going to be including that. I do think that's a great segue to our first tabling activity. Before we jump into that, I will say that if you want, we're going to be shuffling around a little bit. We have some snacks and drinks out in the back of the room by my colleague Ben and Caroline in the back, waving. Again, the bathrooms are in the back right next to the water filling station. Reuse your water bottle, it's great. So what we will do is break out on our tables in front of you. We have pens, papers, dots. A staff member from North Star or from the town is going to join you and help facilitate these conversations. We're hoping to get 6 to 8 people per table. I know that there's a table back there. I don't know if we put a map. We have an extra map. We might be able to just throw it on that table. We have a few seats right up here up front. We have 2 gentlemen who are looking for more friends to chat about the environment. We have 4 in front of us. So please, if you are in the back of the room standing, introduce yourself. We all have name tags. And our team, the North Star team and the town staff will be joining you. So looking forward. This should be about 30 minutes and we will report back. For those online, we will be reconvening in around 25 minutes. So tune back in at 7:30. We will have some of the questions on the screen during this process, so I will cycle through them, and we will put an update on the website, futurefreeport.com, for you to participate tomorrow morning. So thank you.
And then they're going to collect them after and read them, and that feedback is definitely going to be taken.
Yeah, it's still, but too, but even just slowing the traffic down. We will be bringing it back in for more of a community conversation, Q&A. Really, what I want to focus on is all of these topics that we had just talked about. So whether it was the first mapping activity, you spent the whole time with your table talking about it, that's fine. If you guys got to task 2 and task 3, we'd like to hear that as well. Maggie and I will be here to kind of help facilitate the conversation. We have a few more Menti questions as well. To kind of flow. But what we really want to do is hear from you, hear about what Freeport can do as part of this comprehensive planning process, and what we can do as a climate action plan. So again, I will kick this off with a Menti, just to kind of get the blood flowing again, bring everyone back into this space. So again, if you know menti.com on your phone and plug in the code here. Great. So what we're going to do is a little word cloud exercise. And the question is, what is the most important environmental priority for Freeport's future? There could be many, but give me your top. Early bird does get the most screen time. I think going around the tables as these answers are coming in, I heard a lot of things about accessibility, especially to trails, open space, connecting throughout town. What else I heard? Parking along a lot of these open spaces. And I heard a lot of people talking about 295, especially some of the salt marsh work as you come in from Yarmouth. So I will pass it out to you guys. What's on your mind in terms of Freeport's priorities for the future? So if you want to raise your hand and give some thoughts to it. And maybe speak about like the first mapping activity, especially for those who are here on Zoom. What's a priority in terms of what can Freeport fix, these issues? So raise your hand and we can bring over a mic to you.
Hi, can people hear me? So our table spent a lot of time talking about access to all of our open spaces, even more than access within these spaces. And we're pointing out that without a car, most of these spaces are really difficult to get to, and thinking about really wanting children to be able to get there independently, especially playing fields and schools, as well as thinking about older adults if they are feeling like they need a little bit safer way to get there, a real need for sidewalks and paths to allow them to get there without being in the road with traffic.
And we have a lot of old timers, I'll say that, at this table. So we are urging the North Star Planning to really look at the active living plan from 2012, to look at the accessibility task force from the Accessibility Task Force Committee, to look at the wonderful climate action plan and put these in the goals and implementation, because these resources, even the last comprehensive plan we had, really spoke to a lot of these issues.
Table Addy, that's what I.
Table Addy.
I was going to try to ask Cecilia a quick question first, but are you taking in account the all the work that was done around the downtown vision? Because I feel like with that, different committees in town were asked to develop charters, which aren't those like a commitment by the town to do certain actions? Is that how that worked? And wouldn't those provide a framework for what's happening right now with this development? And I haven't heard any real talk about those charters.
What we're working on as part of this, so I mentioned before that these committees are reviewing the inventory chapters. So a lot of that data analysis, the experiences of whether it's the sustainability committee, the planning board, the project review board, all these different bodies in town are kind of giving their perspective as their role. As it relates to the downtown village plan, we're, just like the climate action plan, they're two very recent plans, one adopted, one in the process of being adopted, that we're incorporating into each chapter. So having climate connections throughout, because there's so much intersection between these topics. So for housing, there's obviously connections to downtown village, because they're talking about arts and culture development, the amount of housing, getting people downtown. And then there's goals from the climate action plan that we can include in the policies, making sure that those charters, those committees have the responsibility and the duty to carry out some of that work through the implementation. So there's a lot of different ways that both the climate action plan and the downtown village plan are being incorporated. What I'm hearing is that like the accessibility living plan that Melanie brought up is something else that we can keep incorporating it, seeing what we've accomplished in the last 10 years, 12 years since it's been written, and making sure that we can continue, because it is still a plan for the town. Any other questions, any other comments about table one, about activity one?
Our table as well was interested in access to these resources. So I wonder how many tables actually, by a show of hands, had the same predominant factor was access. Yeah, so definitely that table. It's just really curious to see that this is the leading topic. That, yeah.
With that, I want more access to trails and all of that, but how about if we had a bus? I don't know who'd pay for that. Maybe LL Bean? Have a bus to all the trail sites. I don't want to build more parking lots. They they ran into that in Acadia National Park. They just keep building more parking lots. Let's get a bus system going.
Yeah, definitely. Are there any other tables? I think that table back there, do you want to comment on the accessibility, or this table here, anything else to add to the accessibility or even the, transportation around? No. Cool, and I think what a good point of thinking about what, Acadia is a good example of, they have a really good rapid transit that brings them all around. So they had the problem, and they've kind of created a solution and starting to invest in that transportation infrastructure to kind of supplement people driving around, parking on the road, which can be very dangerous, especially in Acadia. But they have a lot of conserved land. So we know that 14 to 18% of Freeport is conserved. The climate action plan is calling for 30%. But one Menti question here is, how much conserved land should Freeport have? And a question I have for the audience is, where should we prioritize that? Maggie highlighted the undeveloped blocks, how they're fragmented, but there are 8 or 9 locations that are 100 blocks. So as people answer this, I'll pass it out to the audience of where in Freeport should we put more effort in supporting open space and conservation, trail development? What places are lacking? Or based on map activity 1, where do you expect climate change to really impact these trails or open spaces?
Okay, sorry. To me, the question of conserved land is the question of preserving resiliency, and not only for humans, but also for the animals. So I think we should not be talking about land anywhere and not just conservation, but somehow connecting it to make a viable, environmentally positive network.
I think that segues nice into this. And what are these topics that the people in the room, whether it's your table, talked about? What areas in Freeport should be a primary focus for conservation? I think we have a climate action plan that has a lot of goals. The old comp plan had a lot of goals. The downtown village has a lot of goals. What, in your opinion, should be Freeport's priority? What should be done in the next 5 years? What should be done in the next 10 years? What should be done in the next 50 years? Because we can't do everything at once, but as the town gets grants, so.
I guess going back to the last question and point that Chalmers made, I would suggest that our priority for these types of acquiring additional open space might be through riparian zones. I think that would offer the best resiliency, biodiversity play that we can make, as well as habitat connectivity. And not only because it help connect the animals, can help connect the people to the various open spaces around town or beyond.
I guess I just dislike the question because I think the more important question is where and what's the best habitat, we need all of these things. And so it's really about a balance of them and what are the most important wetlands, what are the most important wildlife habitats, where are we lacking parks and recreational spaces. So I just think it's the wrong question. Sorry.
Yeah, that's what we're here for. We're here to get your feedback. This isn't a North Star Freeport Comprehensive Plan. This is yours. So these questions, and the next slide is also in that vein of how can we prioritize? This is, we're helping the planning board, helping town staff kind of write that. And that's a really great feedback of saying, we need to identify where, and that's the point of the mapping exercise. So I appreciate the comment. I think we had one back there and then another one right up here.
I enjoy Freeport's trails and their open spaces, no question about it. But as you start talking about adding more conservation land, adding more trails, adding more, so at some point, this is going to crash into the housing market. And at some point, this is going to crash into property taxes. At some point, we can talk about the individual components, but until you put it all together in a picture that says, we can only afford, X, right? I don't know what that X is, but I don't know how many of you have gotten your tax bills lately. So it just, I hear, brainstorming, and I appreciate the brainstorming component. But one of the things I really want to make sure is that there is financial viability to all of these things.
It is really hard to think about these things in silos because that's not really the reality. And so the next workshop, the future land use visioning one, will I think help us move more into that conversation, thinking about, okay, well, we want affordable housing and we want, to conserve biodiversity. And it's hard. It's really hard.
Question on the front here as well.
I was going to say, talk about housing, that I think we really need to consider if we're going to have any large housing developments, single family housing, that we consider, I don't know what it's called, but leaving a lot of open space. So, and putting the houses closer together so that we do conserve as much forest and woodland and agricultural and open land as we possibly can. I think the question of what can we afford is a really difficult question, because there's two different things we have to think about affording. And we certainly have to be able to live here, and we certainly have to be able to pay our bills, and we certainly have to be able to, send our kids to school. But on the other hand, what's the price we're going to pay if we don't really seriously consider conserving this environment in the most, because we're not going to be able to survive here in a very different way. So I just think and even my husband and I, when we talk about, we're going to the store and, he'll say, how much does X cost? When sometimes the question is, how much does it cost to buy this? What's the cost to the environment? What's the cost anyway? So the question of afford is certainly very tricky. And I hope we can all have lots of conversations about it and think about both things, how much it's going to cost and the cost to the environment.
Oh, I was going to say, and I think too, the comp plan provides a vision, the climate action plan provides a vision so that we can all be sort of moving towards the right direction. But then I think there's a degree of opportunistic conservation that has to happen within that too, right? So we have to be thinking about this long-term vision, but if we have a landowner who has this property that, okay, maybe it's not our highest priority conservation benefit, but the financial benefits there, and it's, good connectivity or whatever it is, it's balancing these things and making sure that we allow flexibility in our overall visioning and our overall planning so that we can pivot along the way.
And I will, before we jump to the next question, I will throw this up on the screen. When we talk about people facing choices and how we prioritize, and again, putting people and understanding that when we try to, put more growth in downtown, where are we conserving, where are we concentrating? Maggie brought up a great point about the future land use workshop. That's on November 18th, right here in this room. Thinking about where are we going to have growth? I know some of our initial conversations about future land uses, how are we connecting a lot of the open spaces in town? Where are opportunities for growth? If we do growth there, what's the impact? A lot of these questions on the screen are kind of balanced that if we do more renewable energy projects, where are we gonna do them? What are the impacts on the landscape? So when you start putting in these challenges, it's hard to answer it now. It's hard to answer the town's responsibility or what the town wants, but creating that framework through a comprehensive plan, downtown villaging plan, or downtown village plan, climate action plan, kind of gives you that, direction of how to move and how to respond to a lot of different components. And I think Sam said it really great at the last planning board meeting, the chair of the planning board, that there's some things you can't plan for, like COVID, even going back to 2008, the recession then. It's hard for towns to balance the urgent needs of the community, but also keep moving towards a more sustainable future. But I think we had a question over there.
I was just going to point out that I think both Peter and Kathleen had really good points about what can we afford, and it points to the importance of having the comprehensive plan. We heard some really interesting things in the housing workshop a couple of weeks ago about exactly what Kathleen was talking about, which is cluster subdivisions. So yes, you're developing housing, but rather than taking one big parcel and breaking it up into somewhat even pieces, you're putting the housing portion of it much more densely together and leaving more open space. And I think the idea of that has come, and it's a good reason why we redo the comprehensive plan every 10 years, is because we often set goals and plans and they end up having the opposite effect. And so this gives us the opportunity to learn from not only what our results have been from planning, but other communities and how we can really target those goals. So one of the other things that came up as a concern in the housing workshop was, if we build all of this high density housing or X number of new housing units, what does that do to the costs of public services, costs of schools? I think when you're talking about open space, there's the other question. If you are keeping open space from turning into high density housing, then you are limiting how much you're growing the population. So the whole point of the comprehensive plan is to balance all of these priorities, and getting all of this input is really important. And so I want to thank North Star for trying to wring it all out of us.
Suzanne's up there.
A lot of the conversation has been about land conservation, but like the name of this workshop is Environment, Natural Resources, and Climate. And that's not just about designating certain plots of land for certain things. It's more about, like, where does our habits of overuse, consumption, pollution come into all this? The land can be conserved, but if the way we, like, our practices, our building practices, our demolition practices, our development practices are not done in a way that is green and climate friendly and sort of, connects us to those open spaces and the relationship we have with them. Where does that come in? Because now you're going to talk about land use, but we haven't really talked about policies around demolition and waste. And, we have a lot of businesses in town that use, have single-use plastic. I see those Dunkin' Donuts things floating all over the place. So where does that come into the picture? It's not just about setting land aside. It's about how we as a community treat that land, and land that's not conserved. What are we doing in those other spaces that impact, especially with, like, just our coastline and the watersheds? There's just water weaving its way through every part of our town and our region. So what's happening on all sides of that water.
I do have a good answer. I think an important key is what is the reach of a comprehensive plan and how far in detail can we go? We've had conversations at the planning board about the importance of implementation and how we can support, like I think you said, charters and those committees and empowering their work, because a lot of their work, like the single-use plastics, banning that type of stuff, thinking about where we're putting trash cans, those are all committees, city departments. But what the comp plan does is allow additional planning, and by keeping the climate action plan as an important piece of future planning, you allow for that level of detail to kind of trickle down from the comprehensive plan that provides a pretty broad framework, but it also enables like the smaller bodies, whether it's the planning board, to talk about what policies will be helpful during site plan development or construction management. But even thinking about the sustainability committee taking on more responsibilities, how they can better manage their conserved lands. So it kind of explodes because there's so many different topics. But that's just my short answer to that. I think we have a question. Chalmers, do you have a comment on that, or do we want to go to a new question? Comment on that. If we can get Chalmers a microphone, and then let's do there, then Chalmers.
I just want to second Kristen's comment, and I would be really proud if in 20 years in Freeport, we were a community that led with that more holistic thinking about what our individual choices are and how they generally impact the environment, even in the spaces that aren't protected. I just really appreciate the comment.
Yes, just quickly, I'm frankly appalled by the attitude toward the comprehensive plan, because if we look at the 2011 one, there are a lot of things in there that said, well, it would be nice if we did this. And I feel our comprehensive plan now should be much more stipulative. It should say, we will do this, so that our various boards don't have to wave it off and say, well, they didn't really mean that.
Do you think that in writing the comprehensive plan, that's a choice on like which policies or strategies get put in, or word choice? Like, I guess I'm curious more about what you're saying.
Yeah, Suzanne, you'll get this back. My understanding is the comp plan of 2011 said it would be nice if this happened. And I think our comprehensive plan now should say this shall happen. The planning board shall do this. We shall change our zoning ordinances to do that. Now, Suzanne, take it away.
Well, I'm going to change the topic. This is a hard thing for me because I know it's asking way too much of your work. But I will say that the idea that you presume that energy, clean energy or renewable energy, has a negative outcome. So that predetermines that CMP will be our go-to infrastructure. And I'd say that there's a much broader way of thinking about that as we move forward into this process, because CMP may not always be there. And I think clean energy can be something that can be very distributed and not connected to the grid necessarily. That's long-term thinking, I know, but it is something to keep in mind, that solar doesn't have to be hooked to the grid.
Been thinking about how the town can, support homes and getting energy rebates, giving that information. So there's renewable energy isn't just infrastructure. It's educating people, investments from the town, investments from people, supporting that growth. So that's a great point. If there's any comments, it is 8:15. We had promised 6 to 8 p.m., but I didn't want to cut off the conversation early. So if there's any final thoughts, anyone want the final word or final question? If not, yeah. Make it great.
I wanted to comment on the comment of my good friend Chalmers about what the plan should do. I really can't imagine the plan commanding action. I can imagine it saying should, not that we could possibly, which is what he was most concerned about the previous plan apparently doing. But I think a plan has to be, this is what we should do.
Cool. I think we will call it here. Thank you all again for coming. November 18th, right back in this room for our future land use workshop, where we really do get into those intersections of it. Please leave anything you filled out on the table. You can leave your trash. We can handle that. Appreciate everything. Thanks, everyone.